Welcome back into LX News. In today's climate, when it feels like others are trying to silence and push aside the LGBTQ plus community, this week reminds us of the importance of defending the human rights of others. May 17th was International Day Against Homophobia, Biphobia, and Transphobia. On that day in 1990, the World Health Organization declassified homosexuality as a mental disorder. And while progress has been made since then, the fight for equal rights, opportunities, and protection is full steam ahead. So here to weigh in on this discussion is Dr. David J. Johns, Executive Director of the National Black Justice Coalition. Dr. Johns, Florida's Don't Say Gay bill, it has not gone into effect yet, but we're already seeing a lot of students speak out against it. As someone who has experience as an educator, how much were you able to discuss LGBTQ history in the classroom, and how often did you feel it was necessary to have those conversations?
Yeah, I'll start with the second question first, but first, just want to say thank you for making space for this important conversation. I taught kindergarten and third grade and thought it incredibly important to have meaningful and sometimes complex conversations with my babies who enrolled me in the process of figuring out the world around them and answering questions about how people showed up in the world and their beautiful diversity was among the great privileges that I had serving as a classroom teacher. With regard to the challenges therein, any educator understands that in order to be a good educator, you have to ensure that the instruction, the curriculum, the materials that you are exposing your students to is appropriate with regard to their level of competence, their cultural understanding, their language abilities. And it was a welcome challenge for me to find ways to ensure that I was able to distill things such that my babies could understand, make sense of, sometimes incredibly complex conversations.
Right. What do you think will be maybe the biggest setback for students and teachers with this bill in place so far? Is it, we've heard arguments that it may hinder classroom discussions. Do you see that as possible?
Very much so. It has already hindered classroom discussions. I've heard from a number of educators who are fearful of the possible implications of these laws once codified. But that's at a bare minimum. I completed my dissertation recently studying how white supremacy and homophobia, biphobia, transphobia show up in public middle and high schools throughout this country. And every one of my research participants talked about the trauma, the mental health implications, about being in spaces where they could not be their full selves, where they couldn't talk about the things that impacted them as whole people, otherwise have access to the language and concepts and resources that help ensure that they thrive in the world. And so beyond the concerns that we should have about people not being able to have conversations, we should be mindful of the fact that so many Black children and LGBTQ children and children who are both Black and or otherwise of color and LGBTQIA+ or queer are already struggling with significant mental health trauma. And those who need the most support often are least likely to have access to it. And so we should be worried about our children's mental, physical, spiritual, psychological well-being.
And that's also what I wanted to talk to you about is, like, what does this look like outside of the classroom? After all of these bills are possibly codified, what does that look like as ripple effects in our communities?
Yeah, there are at least three that come to mind when I think about conversations that we've had thus far. One is disruptions in a child's developmental process. So much of what frustrates me in this moment when we're having conversations about children, about students, is how incredibly complicated the process of development is. And too often adults forget that. And so children who are stifled in the process of understanding who they are in the world that they did not ask to be invited into is a problem that has many implications that the implications will be seen over the years to come. The second is disruptions to families. When I think about the implications of laws in states like Texas, what we have seen is that families have become impacted by the introduction and the conversations around and sometimes the codification of this legislation. Families are no longer seeking the kinds of affirmative care and services that allow children to thrive, and some of them are not able to otherwise work or leave their homes or do the things that they're required to do in order to ensure that they're able to provide for their families. The third thing is, as I think about what just recently happened in the massacre in Buffalo, the massacre in California, reminders of the consequences of ignorance and hate and trauma that is weaponized is terror, right? There are so many people who have and continue to be terrorized by the introduction of this type of legislation, political bullies who are using their pulpits to weaponize and empower other people to act on hate. And that trauma is not only passed down genetically, we know that based on the teachings of folks like Dr. Joy DeGruy, who talks about post-traumatic slave syndrome, but it also prevents us as individuals, as members of communities, citizens of this country from being able to live up to our full potential, which ultimately impacts us all.
Yeah, Dr. David J. Johns, I want to thank you so much for coming here and having this discussion with us. We truly appreciate your insight.
Thank you for having me.
All right, now let's get into some other stories making headlines. We're going to start with some major developments in Ukraine. Hundreds